Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my distinct honor to introduce Chairman John Moolenaar, a leading voice in Congress on competitiveness, national security, and America's technological future. Chairman Moolenaar serves as the chairman of the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, where he has driven some of the most consequential bipartisan work to protect America's innovation base, strengthen supply chains, and ensure that critical technologies are developed and deployed in ways that advance freedom. A trained scientist and longtime public servant, Chairman Moolenaar has championed policies that support American research, advanced manufacturing, and the trusted technology ecosystem from semiconductors and critical minerals to AI, energy, and national defense. He is widely respected for his clarity, integrity, and steadfast commitment to ensuring that the United States and its allies maintain a decisive technological edge. Please join me in welcoming Chairman John Moolenaar.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be with you this afternoon, and appreciate the introduction. And we just want to say the Krach Institute continues to play a leading role in the tech competition with China. And I hope this summit will continue to be a catalyst for further action between the private sector and our federal government. And I also want to say that the Select Committee is really thankful for the leadership Purdue has shown in addressing Chinese influence on campus. The university recently reviewed its policies and adopted new safeguards, including a prohibition on foreign adversary funding. So let's give Purdue a round of applause. In a report in September, we wrote that Purdue's forward-leaning approach should serve as an example to other institutions of higher education. So once again, thank you for leading the way, Purdue. It's a privilege to join all of you today to discuss a topic that will define this century, the global AI race and the security implications of China's pursuit of dominance. The development of today's AI models will determine whose values define the digital future. The Chinese Communist Party has a clear objective: to lead the world in artificial intelligence by 2030. They see AI not as a neutral technology, but as a force multiplier for their own authoritarian power. In this competition for AI supremacy and dominant algorithms, the race begins with hardware. Semiconductors are the foundation of every AI system, and the tools that make those chips, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, or SME, are the choke points of modern technological power. 3 years ago, the United States implemented sweeping export controls to restrict China's access to advanced semiconductors, chip-making tools, and the U.S. expertise required to use them. This action marked a decisive shift in United States policy, recognizing that technology competition with the Chinese Communist Party is inseparable from national security. These controls attempted to cut off Beijing's ability to produce or acquire the high-performance chips needed for advanced AI, supercomputing, and military modernization. However, the Select Committee released a bipartisan report last month showing that the world's top SME toolmakers, 3 American, 1 Dutch, 1 Japanese, sell tens of billions of dollars worth of these tools to China every year. Between 2022 and 2024, each of these companies more than doubled their share of global revenue coming from Chinese state-owned enterprises. Even worse, many of their top customers are entities blacklisted by the U.S. government or entities owned by the Chinese state. China is exploiting the enforcement misalignment of those controls between us and our allies. The equipment it is accumulating is building the capacity to produce chips domestically. This, in turn, will insulate its economy and military from future sanctions and export bans. Through joint ventures, technology licensing, and state-directed capital into Western firms, the CCP is turning the ingenuity of others into Chinese capacity. China's narrative, China's success at circumventing U.S. controls has fed a recent and repeated narrative that export controls don't work, and therefore we should not even try. Critics claim that export controls failed because Huawei still produces chips. But this distorts both the intent and the effect of those controls. The objective of the export controls that began in President Trump's first term was to slow Huawei's advancement and maintain our nation's advantage in the chip race. In the early stages, it worked. 2 years after the controls took effect, Huawei's revenue had fallen by 28%, and the company is only now getting back to its pre-controls revenue. The policy forced the CCP to intervene in Huawei with massive state support and preferential contracts to keep the company alive. That massive hit to Huawei was despite the fact that the previous administration was approving billions of dollars of licenses to sell controlled technology to blacklisted companies. Had the previous administration effectively implemented the controls that began with President Trump, perhaps we would be talking about Huawei in the past tense. Despite the layered license exceptions and carve-outs, the controls have still kept China from the cutting edge of chip technology. A recent Wall Street Journal article described how the CCP is having to ration its advanced chips to its labs due to a lack of production capacity. Furthermore, Chinese companies are still trying to smuggle in U.S. chips regardless of the Chinese government's prohibition on their use. The fact that China continues to have to smuggle U.S. chips is a testament to the effectiveness of our tool controls. We must now effectively implement those controls by plugging the holes in the dam. First, we must close the loopholes. Export controls must evolve with technology, not trail it. The CCP has learned that our entity-based approach is ineffective when Chinese companies can simply change their name to avoid it. Every tool and every component matters. That's why, if we are serious about limiting Chinese advancement, countrywide technology controls are the only way. We must draw a red line to the tech threshold and ensure not a single entity in China is able to access the tool or its supply chain. Second, our controls must be equally enforced by our allies. We must persuade and, if necessary, pressure our allies to enforce synchronized restrictions. And third, we need to strengthen our domestic technology security. This means increasing protections against the inclusion of Chinese technology in U.S. facilities where chips are made. American taxpayers have invested billions of dollars to bring back semiconductor manufacturing. To let Chinese tools into our fab floors would be repeating the same mistake that got us here, sacrificing our economic and national security for a cheaper Chinese product. Fourth, we must empower enforcement, giving the Bureau of Industry and Security real resources to audit, investigate, and to act. In my role on the Appropriations Committee, I've advocated for increased BIS funding, and the bill we passed out of committee increased the Bureau's funding by 59%. Export violations aren't simply a business risk, they're a national security threat, and they should be enforced as such. The Trump administration now has an opportunity to restore simple, high-impact export controls on semiconductor manufacturing equipment, lock in enduring chip dominance over China, and strengthen domestic onshoring of critical supply chains. My committee and I stand ready to help the administration in such an effort because defending our technological superiority is not acting like China, as some allege, but acknowledging the plain reality in front of us. America's advantage has always come from two things: the freedom to innovate and the moral clarity to use that innovation for good. China's AI strategy seeks to erode both, to weaponize openness and rewrite the norms of technological power in the image of authoritarian control. Will we let the CCP define the next generation of technology and innovation, or will we lead with the conviction that built the free world's technological foundation? That's our charge, to ensure innovation serves liberty, not tyranny. Thank you.
Now allow me to welcome back Chairman Keith Krach to the stage for a fireside chat with the chairman, titled From Clean Network to Strategic Competition, in which these leaders will be diving into the future of technology, innovation, and global leadership. Without further ado, take it away, gentlemen.
All right, thanks. Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for being here, and thank you. I think you have the funnest job in Congress. By the way, being chairman of that China Select Committee. One of the things that we announced today was the Global Trusted Tech Network, and following in the footsteps of the Clean Network, where we focused on 5G. This is for all technologies. Give us your thoughts in terms of how important it is to form that global coalition with other democracies.
Well, we've seen that be successful, and I think it's an important model where we look at like-minded nations that we can partner with and say, how can we have our supply chains free of this kind of malign influence? And you mentioned the term trust. Trust can't occur without integrity. And I think it's important that the values that we have in this United States, as well as like-minded allies, is built on integrity and trust, and that's what we need to lead with.
Absolutely. I remember when it was during my U.S. Senate confirmation hearing, and I got asked the question, what would be your China strategy? Because my mission was to develop and operationalize a global economic security strategy to drive economic growth, maximize national security, and combat authoritarian aggression, and primarily China. And, the thing that I said is kind of exactly what you're talking about. Leverage America's three biggest areas of competitive advantage. Number one, by strengthening our relationship with our allies and our partners. Number two, leverage the resources and innovation of the private sector. And then that third one, amplify the moral high ground of these democratic values, which all equal trust.
Well, you look at the Cold War and you look at Ronald Reagan's message, his view of competition is, we win, they lose.
Right.
But he had the vision to talk about the ideological differences, but also have the strength of economy, innovation, our defense capabilities. And truthfully, when you're dealing with authoritarian regimes, that's the only thing they respect, is that kind of strength. And so I think it's important in this regard that we speak directly to these kinds of issues and then also communicate our love for the Chinese people and people throughout Asia. And I think it's important that we continue to build partnerships throughout Asia, because China has continued to encroach on other areas and violate the norms throughout the region. And America has an opportunity to lead with integrity.
Absolutely. And, I think that's important to articulate, that what we're doing is nothing against the 1.2 billion Chinese people that are not part of the elite Chinese Communist Party. It's really that Chinese Communist Party that have implemented this surveillance state, committing genocide, all of that we need to protect against. Now, in the area of AI, let me ask you this, Mr. Chairman. This model of leveraging the resources and innovation of the private sector and forming these alliances with countries based on these principles, how important is that? And what are some of the things that you're doing in Congress that could maybe accelerate that?
Well, we have some tremendous partnerships with like-minded allies who are leaders in this. Yeah, you think of Taiwan, TSMC, you think of the Netherlands, ASML, you think of the leadership that we have in our chip technologies here in the United States. We are in the lead on this. And it's important that we work with countries that we can trust because we want American technology to be the infrastructure around the world, but we also want to work people who will protect that advantage and make sure that doesn't dissipate into the Chinese Communist hands or Iran, Russia, North Korea. And so it's important that we have some safeguards in place when we deal with other countries that says, we want to partner with you, but here are the guidelines that we want to enforce to be part of that partnership.
Absolutely. And I know you've done a lot of work promoting global trust standards. It's the thing we announced last year is what we call the XGTT standard, the X Global Trusted Tech Standard. X stands for, could put AI in there, 5G in there, biotech in there. And the beauty of this standard is that it has all those trust principles in there: respect for rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for property of all kinds, respect for sovereignty of nations, integrity, accountability, reciprocity, fairness, transparency. And this is something that has really caught on, and we've got really a dream team. This is a board of governors from all these different countries, all these different experts. And tell me a little bit about the work you're doing in standards and how this might fit in.
Well, we're trying to look at this in a comprehensive way. We want to make sure we have export controls that make sense, that limit technologies from getting into adversaries' hands, but are used around the world. And we want to make sure we know where our chips are going. So, we have legislation in the Chip Security Act because what we find is, there's smuggling going on, and we want to know where those chips are going. So those are two of the things. The other thing we're working very much, and this is a challenge, is we have American investor dollars, and in many cases, government dollars going in that fund partnerships or businesses aligned with the Chinese military, companies that are abusers of human rights, violate the Uyghur laws. And so it's creating an awareness, whether it's investors, whether it's businesses who are trying to figure out, who they can partner with, and making sure that we hold to the integrity and the standards that you're talking about. But the awareness, I'll give you one example. There's a Chinese military battery manufacturer, Cattle, and, we had JP Morgan and Bank of America leading their IPO in Hong Kong. And then you have other examples like this where you have American investor dollars that are partnering and helping to advance the agenda that they may totally disagree with, but because of the Chinese national security laws, they aren't able to do the due diligence on that, and they may or may not even know that they're in violation of, the Uyghur laws or the, partnering with the People's Liberation Army. So it's kind of this global awareness and holding ourselves as well as to our partners to a higher standard.
Yeah. That was a lot of work we did at the State Department on that, is trying to educate American citizens to realize that those pension funds, for example, that they're in, are financing China's surveillance state, their war machine. Particular guys we target was MSCI's emerging, index fund, right? And there was a lot of these where it's tough to know. And one of the other things that we did is we published all the subsidiaries of the countries or the companies that were on the Treasury's OFAC list, right? The Chinese ones, because they know what to do. And so we needed to make sure, because they'll go do a joint venture 50-50. That doesn't come under the OFAC, regime. And so we would publish all this stuff. And one of the interesting things is there are 500 companies on a commerce entity list that we will not export to, but we're not on the OFAC list. So we've got to integrate within the federal government that.
You're absolutely right, both in terms of outbound investments as well as technologies that are coming here and we become dependent on here in the United States. You look at drone technology, you look at the cranes in our ports and how much of a dependence there is on Chinese technology. In the automotive sector, and I know you have a lot of experience, you look at the dependence on battery technologies, it's shocking. And they've gotten to this point, and I think it was a real wake-up call for America when China threatened to shut off the critical minerals.
Yeah, it was.
And I applaud the president for negotiating a 1-year reprieve in that. But the challenge is, negotiating with China is getting them to keep their agreement. And 6 months from now, a year from now, their viewpoint could be very different. And so it's going to be very important for American companies, that we reduce our reliance on our supply chains and recognize that they're not playing by the same rules.
Right.
So when we try and develop critical minerals capabilities here in the United States, they're going to be very quick to try and undermine those efforts through unfair trade practices, and we need to be cognizant of that fact.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. One of the things we did is when I went to the State Department, I said, let's look at the last 40 years of agreements that we had with China, and I wanted to see how many that they honored that didn't suit their purposes. The answer was 0. So we do an agreement with them. They know we're going to honor it. And they're thinking, well, we don't have to honor it unless it works out for us. And that's why you've got to have, some type of quid pro quo on that or some way to enforce that. I was glad to hear you talking about enforcement because that's been something that we've been a little bit weak on. And let's face it, they're sneaky, bringing all that stuff in, right? They've perfected it to an art. And we've got to clamp down on that. And I'm glad you're putting resources behind BIS. The assistant secretary over there, he worked in our team. He's great. So keep your eyes out for Dave Fogel.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important to give them the tools they need to, I remember meeting with leaders in a foreign country and they talked about, sometimes a ship will come in and then a ship will leave and they don't really know what's on that ship. And, then there are people who say, well, there's no smuggling going on. And we realize, we are ahead in this area. China is trying desperately to catch up, and they're going to use every means possible to do that. And so it's going to be identifying who we can trust and work with, and then give our agencies the ability to enforce the laws on the books and make sure if there are loopholes, we need to fix that in Congress.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another big objective is to educate the corporations and assist them. One of the companies that won our Trusted Tech Freedom Award is Strider, and they go into companies and they use open source, but they in essence can track if somebody was part of the PLO, they track the supply chain, all of that. And so these audits are critical, I think, in these high tech companies because most of these guys, it's almost a new thing. I didn't know this much until I entered into the government, right? So.
Yeah, I think, just having watched this over the years, I grew up, as we talked, in a manufacturing town and had, a company that was doing global business. And, I still remember very clearly when the idea was China is going to be this vast market. They're going to become wealthier. They're going to become more democratic, more freedom loving, and it's going to be a win-win for everybody. And we've seen under Xi Jinping just the opposite. And now those same businesses who had such great aspirations are being basically chased out of the country, being undermined through unfair trade practices. And, I think in some ways when you have Wall Street helping with IPOs and Hong Kong seems to be the place where these things are happening, Hong Kong's very different now than it was years ago.
Hong Kong is China.
Yeah. And, I meet in this role with, the daughter and the son of Jimmy Lai, who's in prison for speaking out. I met with family of, pastors who were recently rounded up. And so you realize that the sort of the friendly face of China is not what is happening through a totalitarian regime that simply is the biggest oppressor of their own people, as well as trying to export that around the world.
Yeah, and I think they really are. If you look at the Great China Firewall, it's designed so that none of their data goes out, but all of it comes in, and what goes out is their propaganda, and the truth does not come in. And basically, through tools like TikTok and those, they are extending the China firewall and collecting this data. And that's the scariest thing of all is AI, because these guys are catching up to us really fast. They have more data. The only way I think that we can defeat their monopoly on AI, and then it would be really scary, is we've got to form this trusted, this global trusted tech network, because we got to work with our allies. We've got to convince, and the private sector.
And we need to keep our allies aware. It's always interesting to me, our European allies. So one day, Macron in France is talking about how they may have to send French soldiers in to defend Ukraine against Russian aggression. And then a week later, he's going to China to meet with Xi Jinping and talk about how they can build stronger alliances. I recently saw Germany is now kind of reaching out, trying to, and you realize, okay, would Russia be attacking Ukraine right now if China was not propping them up financially and through different equipment? And the answer is no.
Right.
And so there needs to be a greater awareness and understanding that these things are all related.
Yeah.
And we need to speak with clarity on these issues.
We do. All the time, nonstop, and get that private sector. It looks like we're close to running out of time. One of the questions I want to ask you is, what can the Krach Institute do for the China Select Committee that could help out your work or your mission or your goals, but also maybe line out a little bit of, your top priorities?
Well, first of all, you're leaders in technology and understanding this connection, because it advances so quickly. And, I think there is a sort of a debate going on where you have people who have more of a libertarian view that says we want to get American technology out there as much as possible. And in many ways, I resonate with that. However, when you look at adversarial countries with malign intent in many cases, there has to be that national security component. And where you put those guardrails is really a question where I think there needs to be a active debate going on in Congress with the administration to say, how can we have a policy that is clear for our private sector, for investors, people who, academic institutions, and at the same time, balance those two competing priorities.
Right. I think clarity is the key thing. It's I was on the CFIUS committee, and to have clarity, instead of taking one case at a time, come up with whole categories. Those kind of things, I think, are really important.
One thing, just in terms of academic institutions, because I want to applaud Purdue. I want to applaud my another Big Ten school, University of Michigan. They've had a number of instances with students who have been caught, Chinese nationals, different activities. And it's really important that we figure out a way to differentiate students, individuals who want to come here, live the American dream, or simply want to learn, versus those who are being leveraged by the Chinese Communist Party, either they or their family. And knowing that the Chinese national security laws say basically any Chinese national is accountable to doing whatever the CCP
They have to
tells
turn over any,
no matter where they are in the world.
or their grandma goes to Gulag.
Yeah. And so it's very important that we make that distinction and actually help Chinese nationals who are feeling leveraged to actually report that.
Right.
And that's probably a difference, it's a different way of thinking, but to recognize
I love it.
freedom is on their side, and in the United States, we want to protect people's freedom.
Right. I think that's great. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up, Mr. Chairman. Let's give a big round of applause for Mr. Chairman John Moolenaar. Thank you for your service, everything you do. Krach Institute is behind you.